The Dorkening and all affiliated shows are not intended for anyone under the age of 18. The following may contain discussions or scenes that have adult situations, graphic violence, nudity, strong sexual content, and graphic language. This show is intended for mature audiences only. Viewer discretion is advised.
Rise and shine, my sinners. When Father Evil starts his day, he gets a little deadly. Deadly Grounds coffee has the richest, smoothest flavor you'll find anywhere. It's sinfully delicious. Once you go deadly, you never go back. Order yours at getdeadly.com. Coffee's so good, it's scary.
Persons under 18 will not be admitted.
What the fuck are we gonna do now? Get high? Hey! Welcome back. I think we missed last week. Yeah, we did. I was on vacation. What? Whoa, what? Am I loud? Did I blow out your ears?
A little bit. I had to turn down my volume.
Okay, well, it's not time for you to talk, so shh.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, seriously.
Movie magic. Movie magic.
Welcome to another amazing episode of Still Toking with. You know who I am, so I'm not even going to introduce myself. But the voice you heard in your ear was, of course,
it's me, the one and only Jar Jar.
Jar Jar's in the house.
Woohoo!
And back from his long, extended vacation on vacations. Oh, it's Jeff.
Well, no, I was on vacation, and then you went on vacation, so I kind of missed 2 weeks. Poof.
Oh, yeah.
Gone.
Yeah. Well, didn't you miss the week before that, too, because of something else?
Personal
stuff that you had to deal with?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, so it's been 3 weeks. So you've had an extended, yes, you've had an extended vacation. But
no, there was one in between. There was one in between.
Oh, maybe.
I don't know.
I don't know. Maybe.
I have CRS. Don't ask me about freaking more than 3 days ago.
I know that problem.
Yeah, 3 minutes ago.
But
so anyway.
I mean, yeah, I'm looking forward to chatting with this guy tonight.
Right?
Investigative reporter, author, columnist. I mean, right off the bat, I'm like, okay, this guy's controversial. Let's chat.
Right. Right. But you forgot. I think you forgot one of the most important things: Pulitzer Prize winning.
You didn't let me finish.
Well, I would have started with that.
No, you don't start with that. You don't start with that. You do like this stuff, and then you do that stuff. But anyway, let's just bring him in. Dan Luzadder. Did I say that right?
You did.
See?
Oh, that's unusual.
Well, there's so many ways I could have fucked that name up.
Well, I've heard it every fucked up way that's possible.
Right?
Oh.
So, welcome to our fuck show.
Thank you. Thank you.
Whoa.
Right? He's throwing us right in the gutter. Like,
right off the bat.
Right off the bat. Derailed. 6 minutes in. It's
That's
all
where
good.
That's where I find my best stories, is in the gutter. Right?
Well, welcome to our show then. You can only go up from here, Dan. Trust me.
All right. That's good.
Yes, we start at the bottom and go straight back up.
All right.
So let's talk about first the Manchurian journalists.
Right.
Or should we start at the beginning? Where do you guys want to go?
You let it off. Go.
All right. Well, I'm going to go actually to the beginning. Like, you started at 15 doing work for like journalist cop beats and stuff, like writing down all that stuff.
That's just a rumor. I didn't start till I was 17.
Oh, 17. Oh, look at me. I already got bad info.
Well, that happens. No, I was, I got out of high school. I was during the Vietnam War. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I snuck into college to get a college deferment. Somebody approached me and asked me to work on as a sports editor on the local newspaper, and I kind of liked it. And then I got a job on the local daily paper covering cops. So I was doing the night cops beat when I was still underage. And I like to tell the story that at the end of the evening back in the day when newspapers were vigorous, at the end of the shift, I'd go pick up 50 newspapers and take them around to what we called the traps, the various places where I'd stop during the night. And I always made sure city detectives was the last stop, because when I went in there and threw the papers down, they'd pull out a bottle of whiskey and pour a shot for everybody, including the 18-year-old kid. So
Nice.
Yeah.
Those were better times.
That was my
bonus.
And
Right.
Yeah.
So how did that all transfer into becoming an investigative journalist?
It was a long and circuitous route, but with a couple stops off along the way. But I ended up as a columnist later on for a mid-sized paper in northern Indiana, and while I was there doing columns, I was doing things a little differently than a lot of people. I was writing off the street. I very seldom went in the office. I hung out with all kinds of interesting characters, and I spent a lot of time in bars, which is where you find interesting characters, right? And so I was doing the column, and we won the Pulitzer in '83 for general local reporting, and some of my work was featured in college textbooks after that on how to do feature stories in the midst of crisis and that kind of thing. So as I was doing the column, I got better and more interesting sources. And I realized I could do better work as an investigative reporter than a columnist. So I took a job on a major newspaper with the investigative team, and I stayed with investigative reporting for the next 40 years.
Wow. So you brought up, in 1983, you guys, you won the Pulitzer. But you were also nominated 2 more times for your investigative work,
right,
on a really big story back then, which was how the police handled the Columbine High massacre.
Yes, that's right. That's I covered Columbine. I was kind of an interesting backstory to that. I was, constantly getting in trouble with editors because I disagreed with them often on what we should write and what we shouldn't write. So I was on double secret probation. They took me off investigative and sent me down to cover the State House in Colorado. And I, just before that, I'd investigated organized crime's attempt to take over the taxi industry in Denver, and published a big story and done a lot of underground sources with them. And so 3 days into the Columbine case, I got a call from, they didn't call me in. They called all the reporters in from around the city, and everybody was working out of the newsroom, but I didn't get a call. And after 3 days, the city editor called me and he said, we got a problem. He said, we've let police beats slide and we can't get access to anybody in the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department. They won't answer their phones. We don't even know who's running the investigation. I said, what do you want me to do? They said, find out who's running the investigation, maybe? I said, okay, give me an hour. So I had done, the cabs were running drugs and guns at the time. And so I had done a lot of work with some snitches who informants for cops who were in the gun trade. So I started calling those sources, and I finally hit one who said the cops were looking for the guns. He couldn't tell me where they came from. He couldn't tell me where, but if I would check on a gun that was used to kill a police officer, a Jefferson County Sheriff's deputy, I might find that the guns came from the same place. So I had the newspaper library look up the detective who had investigated the shooting of their deputy, and I called his phone, got voicemail, left a message, said, I want to know where the gun came from that was used to kill Officer Tim Mossbrucker, and left that message. And about 15 minutes later, I got a call from John Kickbush, a lieutenant in the department. He said, you asked this question, I want to know why. And I said, meet me for coffee and I'll tell you. So from then on, I was working with Kickbush and was on the inside of the investigation. And I spent the next several months literally inside with the cops, looking at everything they looked at, seeing everything they saw, et cetera.
Wow.
So
Wow.
that was the Columbine case.
Wow.
Wow. Did you ever feel your life was in danger at any point during that whole thing?
Not during Columbine, no, but I've had some close calls with people. I've been chased a few times. I was held hostage for an hour with a guy who was on the lam from the law, and I was doing an interview with him, and he thought I'd called the cops on him, and so he kept me at gunpoint for an hour. We finished the interview, and then I went home. But there's been a lot of little things like that.
I would imagine.
Little things like that. Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's a tedious hour.
I mean, I guess I could see that, especially being an investigative reporter, because you're, like you said, you were reporting on, organized crime, taking over the taxis, running drugs and guns, which right there in itself puts you in the crosshairs.
Well,
I
was in a bar that was used as a central point to run guns, and they figured out who I was, and I made a hurried exit down the steps, not under my own speed. It was they kicked me out in a dramatic way, but that comes with the territory.
Okay. Wow. So, how do you know that you can actually trust the sources that you're dealing with?
Well, that's a process. And it's one that takes a while to learn, and you double check them, and you take the stories that they tell you and you run down as much information about them as you can. You double check with other sources, and eventually you either come to the conclusion that you can trust them, you can't trust them, or maybe you can trust them a little bit. Something, a lot of sources will tell you something that's true amid a lot of other things that aren't true. So it's your job to sort out what is and isn't. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. That's what I do with the news every day now.
Right. We all do. Yeah. Yeah. You gotta watch every single program to even get a sense of what might be true. Yeah.
Right.
So over the years, you've done a lot of things, and recently you've just released is this your second book now?
Well, actually, both books came out on the same day, different publishers. Yep. Just a coincidence. The book, Street Talk, was a collection of columns, but the Manchurian journalist I've been working on for about 5 years, pretty steadily. And that whole story started out of a kind of an interesting experience. I got a call from the Church of Scientology. They were launching a new magazine, or actually relaunching their old magazine, and they were looking for an investigative reporter who knew the ropes that might be able to help them with some stories. But when I got to talking to them, actually, they were interested in me taking a look at the media coverage about the church and whether or not it had been fair. So I spent some time digging into that. And it happened that Lawrence Wright, who's a writer for The New Yorker, who's a published author, who's won a Pulitzer Prize for his book on Al Qaeda in 2008. He had written a book about the Church of Scientology. So I began to look at the book and kind of pull it apart from an investigative reporter's viewpoint. And I found a lot of problems with it. But then I found something that was a lot more interesting than his book about Scientology. I discovered that he'd participated in a program that had been put together by the CIA and the State Department to recruit journalists into magazines and publishing, into basically into the effort during the so-called cultural Cold War to influence how Americans thought about communism and about other forms of government. And it turned into a really fascinating exploration of an elite adjunct to the CIA that helped them put together clandestine programs that recruited people into the publishing industry, into magazines, into newspapers. So that was the real story that I found there. And I pulled apart Lawrence Wright's personal story, and I found that he'd created some stories that appeared not to be true. So the Manchurian journalist delves into all that. Lawrence Wright's kind of an illustration of how journalists can become involved in programs that we don't know about. We don't know what their agenda might be. We don't know what the background is.
Right.
Since we don't do much investigative reporting anymore, except for those rare things on television where they devote long-term or long-form stories to more in-depth reporting. We don't see much newspaper investigative work except the New York Times, the Washington Post. The rest of that whole genre is gone, more or less.
Right.
Right. So do you think that journalists of today, a portion, maybe a minority, a majority, 50%, are just saying what they're told to say? They don't investigate anything anymore, do they?
Well, I don't think they get the time to investigate anything. There's still a lot of good journalists out there, but what we have seen is the decline in newspapers. And newspapers were the foundation of good journalism in this country. Mm. I started at a very young age. I was, in the early 70s. And then at that time, even on medium-sized newspapers where I worked, there was a lot of old hands who would show you the ropes. They'd been around forever. They knew how to build source networks. They knew how to find their way into the back door in City Hall, or where the secrets were hidden, and they would teach you those things. But that institutional knowledge is gone. What newspapers there are left have hired younger reporters without experience because they work for less money, not a lot less money, but a little less money, and so we've lost a whole. I think, network of intelligence within the newspaper business about how to go about doing it. So, investigative reporting to a lot of people now is you pick up the phone and you call somebody and you actually speak to them. Mm-hmm. That's not investigative reporting from my experience. I've climbed chain link fences and to check truck plates for stolen vehicles. I've been in a lot of bizarre situations. I covered prisons for quite a while and developed an incredible source network in the prison system, which eventually wound up on causing me to get called in to negotiate for hostages on death row one night, because prison inmates knew me so well that I was the one they wanted to talk to when they had a hostage situation going.
Wow, that's crazy.
But source building is a huge thing for a journalist, and as I say, there's still a lot of good journalists out there, but the training that you never got in college and still don't get in college, that you learn, the things you learn on the street, and the things you learn from old hands who tell you what to do and what not to do and how to approach people, a lot of that's missing.
Okay.
Go ahead, Judge. I was going to ask, what do you think is the most significant story you've broken in your career?
Well, that's a hard one. I've investigated. I investigated a vocational school that turned out to be accessing federal guaranteed student loan funds to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars when they weren't really providing any education to anybody. They were truck driver training school. And then I discovered that they had a private jet. And then I discovered that they used that jet to fly every member of the U.S. Senate Education Committee all over the country whenever they wanted to go. They called it the Senate Shuttle. And that story was significant because it exposed a lot of heavyweight corruption, and it also exposed the weakness of the Justice Department in trying to pursue it. I had FBI agents come to me and say, look, we want to get deeper into this story, but until there's some pressure, some press on it, we're not going to make any headway. Well, as I started covering it, breaking stories about it, talking about gifts that were given to Ted Kennedy and to Dan Quayle and to Bob Dole and their free trips and their other largesse, it didn't have enough attention. Eventually, the Justice Department did sue them for hundreds of millions of dollars, and they forced the company into bankruptcy. But they were a juggernaut for political contributions. They were generating political contributions out of these guaranteed student loan funds. So that was a major story that I covered, an important one. And
crazy.
And it also resulted in me being run out of Indianapolis because because one of the people that received gifts from this company and assistance and funds, Dan Quayle, his uncle owned the paper that I was working for. And so they let me work on that story. But when I began to get into a state judge who had taken some favors from the company and who had rendered a favorable divorce ruling for the CEO that owned the company, things got complicated for me. That judge was on his way to the state Supreme Court, and he was heavily protected by powerful political forces there. So they ended up, the company or their minions hired private investigators. They had them watching my house 24 hours a day. I had my house swept for bugs a number of times. I had threats, those kinds of things. And eventually, this judge sued me for libel with the assistance of the newspaper. And it forced me out. That's why I left Indianapolis and went to Denver and took a job as an investigative reporter there. Before I left, the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court gave me a call and asked me to come down to his office. And he said, we're coming with some disciplinary action here, but we're not going to be able to get there for a while. I think you ought to stay at the newspaper and hang on. I said, too late, too much going on. But they did come behind me. They took the judge off the bench. He was the first sitting judge in the history of the state to be removed from the bench for cause. And of course, the libel suit just evaporated.
Wow.
And this is just one story of, I'm sure,
many
thousands and thousands and thousands of just what's really going on out there. Your average citizen and individual just doesn't even know.
Yeah, and
that's pretty sad.
We don't get to those stories because we're focused on things that are easier to get to.
Right.
Don't devote the resources to really digging into things. It took me a long time to get into the depth of those stories and hundreds of interviews really. Over time, I traveled to 19 different states, and as part of that investigation, you just don't see that commitment anymore. But the Indianapolis Star at the time had a crack investigative team, and they'd won a couple Pulitzers. They investigated police corruption, the FBI corruption in Indianapolis that exposed a lot of things, and I worked with a great team back then. And but you don't see that anymore. Those jobs aren't available.
How much money do you think is lost in corruption in today's world?
I think that's a tough one to guess at, but the question sort of raises another one. What is corruption all about? And I think a lot of people think when you talk about police corruption, for example, you're talking about money and payoffs. That's not necessarily how it works. Mm-hmm. There are favors, there are jobs, there are positions. There's a lot of things that are controlled by police that are influenced by police corruption. I'm working on a documentary film now into a series of crimes that happened in Speedway, Indiana back in 1978, and I've been familiar with this case forever. The there were 5 murders. All of the murders have been left unsolved. There was a series of bombings in between the murders, and there was a conviction in that case. The individual who was convicted had been a marijuana smuggler, and supposedly he set off these small bombs in the middle of Speedway to divert police from paying attention to him, so to speak. A ridiculous theory on the part of the cops, I think. But he was convicted of these bombings, and he spent 19 years in prison. I discovered, as I was researching this case 3 years ago, that there had been misconduct by the police, and his jury had been tainted. And this individual, his name was Brett Kimberlin, and he was fairly high profile at one time. A New Yorker writer wrote a book about him called Citizen K. Really didn't get into his story the way it should have. But the documentary film I'm working on now really probes what happened to Brett Kimberlin, the efforts to convict him of this case, even to the point of putting someone on the jury who was a cousin of one of the primary witnesses in the case. So,
okay.
Yeah,
I didn't even know that was possible.
Yeah, well, we wouldn't think it would be. And it wouldn't have ever been disclosed, except that the individual who was the witness confessed that to me as I was investigating the case. So there's more to do on this, but it raises a lot of questions about political corruption that existed in Indiana at the time and the reasons why these cases were never solved. Police officers who were involved basically were basically involved in misconduct, and they also ruined the crime scene at the most vicious of the murders, in which 4 kids were kidnapped from a restaurant and killed, later murdered in a field. Yeah. So those unsolved crimes we're going to pursue and see if we can't bring an answer to that eventually.
Yeah, I was going to get into that after the documentary film, but I'm glad you brought that up, because that type of stuff is the thing I like to watch. I like to watch those types of documentaries on what you just explained. Let's just leave it there. I don't want to get into the whole thing all over again, but you know, I mean, that stuff really, I'm like, wow.
Well, you know, I was approached by a filmmaker out of LA who was also from Indiana and was familiar with this case, and we got to talking about it. And I said, you know, we just don't have the avenues for investigative reporting anymore. Let's look at this documentary as investigative journalism. Let's try to put it together in a way that really shows how you do an investigation from the outside, investigating police and corruption. So that's what we're working on, and we're making some good progress.
Awesome. Now, without good investigative reporting, how do we get down to the truth now in today's world?
You know, I don't think reporting has to be investigative to get down to the truth. I think what we need are good nuts and bolts reporting on a daily basis. Okay. A lot of the time when I've been talking about the Manchurian journalist, I get a lot of questions about the state of journalism and where we're at today. Right. I don't think people even realize what we're missing. You know, journalism is local and should be local. We are all tuning in now to the national news, and we're getting the national news and the events, but we're not getting much about our local communities anymore. One of the things newspapers used to do is they published a list, an agate type of marriages and divorces that were filed, lawsuits that were filed, court cases, various things. They produced a record of our lives on a daily basis. And for me, an investigative reporter, when I'm looking at something years ago, I go back to the old newspaper archives and I dig up all the stories I can find, even the ones that are 2 inches long, that tell you that so-and-so met with so-and-so about something or other. Those things are valuable. They establish a point in time, and they establish some history. But we're losing all that history, all that record that had been created by a vigorous news media. And we did have a vigorous news media when I started. But we don't have that anymore.
Okay. Now, in that sense, in your opinion, is the internet good or is the internet bad?
It's both. It's good in that we open up some ideas, I think, but it's bad in that we don't have the expertise in journalism to follow certain rules. I mean, anybody can be a journalist. Anybody can promote what they want. But as far as hardcore nuts and bolts reporting, I mean, where an individual goes down, talks to multiple sources about whatever it is that's going on, and comes back and produces a 5 or 6 inch story about that it took them 2 or 3 hours to do, that puts on the record something important. We don't have that anymore. Mm-hmm. It's just not there. So the internet, has opened up a lot of things, but it's destroyed credibility for most things. We look at the Washington Post or the New York Times and we think, well, that's credible reporting, and so we can depend on that. But we don't look to the Denver Post anymore to produce credible reporting. We don't look to the Indianapolis Star. What they're writing about is sports events. They're writing about feature stories. They don't have beat reporters out there anymore that are covering City Hall day in and out, who know all the people in City Hall. I mean, reporters in the day, they knew every secretary in every office. You knew when their birthdays were. You knew, who their kids were. You talked to them on a daily basis. You got to know them. And when you wound up going to their house at night, knocking on the door saying, I need this, they responded and they'd help you. We don't have that system. So,
right.
Yeah. That's fine.
Right. So real quick, before we get into our next questions, I just want to tell our viewers and our listeners later, if you're interested in either of the books, The Manchurian Journalist or Street Talk by Mr. Luzadder.
Yep.
Luzadder. I screwed it up, folks.
There you go.
Make sure you check the show notes up above or down below, depending on where you're watching or listening to us, because all his information and all the links to these books are in those show notes. Okay, we can move on to the next question.
All right.
What's the secret behind Al Capone's name? Is he still with us?
Al Capone the dog?
Yes.
I am sorry to report that Al Capone has left us at age 14. He was the best dog I ever had. But the reason he's named Al Capone, it was named Al Capone, was because I've been working on a book for quite some time about Al Capone.
Oh, nice.
And the fact that Al Capone never ran the Chicago mob. That's one of the American myths that journalism has created, and the yellow journalists of Chicago back in the day created the idea that Al Capone ran the mob. He didn't. It was run by a guy named Jake Guzik, who was a Russian Jew, who's billed in history as Al Capone's accountant. But that wasn't the case. And the reason that I got involved in doing that and looking into that was because of an individual that I met in a bar up in northern Indiana one Saturday afternoon. He was from Chicago, and he was kind of mouthy and loud. And I walked in there with my girlfriend, who was pretty attractive, and he made over quite a bit. I wound up writing a column about that afternoon in the bar, and just a kind of a sight and sound column about this guy from Chicago, this mouthy guy. So he called me up about 2 weeks later. He said, "Hey, you wrote a story about me in your newspaper. I didn't tell you could do that." I said, "Well, I don't need your permission." He said he gave me hell. But after a while, he said he liked the story. He was okay with it. And he had a farm up in northern Indiana. He said, "You should stop by sometime and see me." Well, I said, "Sure, I will." So I did. It turned out his father was a little more interesting than him. His father was Jimmy Hoffa's liaison to the Chicago mob. His father was Tony Accardo's midnight pinochle partner. And his father and I became close, and his father became a mentor to me. And he's the one that told me, after I'd known him a good number of years and asked him and tried to convince him to let me write some stories about him. He said, "Well, you're going to write a book. You write this book. You write it about the fact that Al Capone never ran the mob, and the mob in Chicago was never Italian. It was always multi-ethnic. It was Irish. It was Jewish. It was Russian. You name it. There were all kinds of ethnicities there, but it's characterized as the mafia." Well, he was an incredible source and an incredible individual to have as a mentor. And we spent years talking about things. And he wanted me to write this book because he wanted the truth to be known about Capone and about the construct of the mob. So I finished that book, and I'm still working with the manuscript, but hopefully I'll get it out next year. And we'll have some other stories to tell about Chicago.
Wow.
I've been lied to my entire life.
Yeah, you have. Yeah. And it wasn't until you met me that you found out about it, right? Well, I mean, there are so many myths that are created by the media, and I don't think they're created necessarily on purpose, but Al Capone became Al Capone because he was accessible to reporters. Jake Guzik was never accessible to reporters. During the course of that experience, as I was working with my mentor, whose name was Angelo Petiti, he introduced me to a lot of people, including the nephew of Jake Guzik. And then Jake Guzik's nephew introduced me to Jake Guzik's son, who was still alive at the time and in his 80s. And he refused to talk to me. He finally agreed to meet me for dinner one night. And he was brusque, and he told a couple of stories, and then he was done. But the next day I went back to his house. I went down to his house on the south side of Chicago, and he answered the door, and he said, "I already talked to you. Go away. I haven't got anything else to say." And he started to shut the door, and I stuck my foot in it. And I just kept talking for the next 20 minutes, half an hour. And finally he let me in, and I spent the next 3 days there. And I recorded our conversations, and we talked about anything and everything. And it was a fascinating experience with a lot of new information that people don't know yet to this day.
Wow.
That's really cool.
So persistence pays off.
Yeah.
Persistence is important. This, as I mentioned, this case in Speedway, I started working on that in 1986. I'm still working on it.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a long time.
Persistence.
Do you have any plans to write any fictional books?
I've never delved into fiction very much. I've got some favorite authors in fiction that I love. James Lee Burke is my famous my favorite famous detective writer. I think I have all his books that he's ever written. And I've thought about detective fiction, or maybe spy stuff. I've had some experiences with the CIA. I attended the CIA station chief in Paris. I attended his 50th birthday party, and I've met some very interesting characters along the way that were in the agency.
Nice.
So he's here to bring us the truth, Jar Jar.
Oh.
It's like the X-Files. The truth is out there.
Right.
The truth is out there. You just have to work really hard to find it, and then you got to document it. And that's the thing.
That's the hard part.
Yeah, that's the hard part.
Now, do you? I don't like the word brainwashing. I like the word being controlled instead.
Yeah.
But I see an awful lot of that out there right now, and even in the past.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? A lot of people use the word, "Oh, you're brainwashed." No, I don't. I think it's controlled by media. That's how I see it.
Well, that's an interesting observation, and I named this book "The Manchurian Journalist" to play off of Manchurian Candidate. Right. And the Manchurian Journalist doesn't exactly refer to Lawrence Wright, but it refers to the idea of journalists who are influenced to report in certain ways or to support things in certain ways. I don't think journalists are brainwashed. But I do think that there is an effort to control what's reported. And that's what the heart of the Manchurian Journalist is about. I tracked Wright's. Lawrence Wright was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War, and he wrote a memoir when he was just 39 years old about his experiences and how he became a journalist. And as I followed meticulously everything he'd written about that in his path, I discovered that his conscientious objector story had a few holes in it. I talked to probably a dozen or more conscientious objectors during the Vietnam War. All of them went through an intense process with the draft board in which they had meetings and hearings and brought witnesses and tried to convince them to give them CO status. Well, Lawrence Wright got his CO status on the strength of a single essay. And it turned out that his father had friends on the Dallas draft board. Not only that, but some very powerful people who helped create the cultural Cold War in this country, and the propaganda programs that went on domestically tied to the CIA. Was a close associate of Lawrence Wright's father. Lawrence Wright's father actually ran a bank that was owned by this individual, Robert Story. Story was had a very low profile in history, but he was the chief executive trial prosecutor in the Nuremberg war trials. He was head of the American Bar Association, head of the International Bar Association, and he was also one of the prime movers in developing the kind of CIA that we have today. Well, Lawrence Wright never mentioned this relationship in anything he wrote about his father and Robert Story, and I found that fascinating. So as I pulled together these various parts of his story and began to research library archives and things I could find, I discovered that he had attended something called the Radcliffe Publishing Procedures course, a 6-week summer course at Radcliffe College in Boston. And this course was fairly well known. The Radcliffe Publishing Procedures course produced the 100 top novels of the year, the 100 top books every year, but they had a very different purpose. And the woman who ran that program, Helen Venn, I discovered was a recruiter for this intelligence network that was developed in cooperation with the CIA to propagandize people. And she placed journalists in magazines. She placed editors in publishing houses. She had a 97% placement rate for her little 6-week summer course every year. And she became a special friend of Lawrence Wright. She was his reference when he then got a job with American University in Cairo to satisfy his public service commitment for his conscientious objector status. He got a job teaching English over there. Well, it turned out the American University in Cairo was a CIA outpost in the Mideast, and they were using the teaching of English to infiltrate various places around the Middle East. And Lawrence Wright was a participant in that program.
Wow. Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Jeez.
There's a lot more.
You know,
you got to read the book to understand how all those pieces fit together.
You know, now a lot of what we've been talking about is 20 years ago, 40 years ago, the 80s. We've been talking a lot about that.
Yeah.
If we were to take that and jump to today, is it still just going the same as it always did, or is it actually getting worse in your opinion?
Well, I don't know if you can evaluate it as worse or better, but I think the question is what still exists today as far as recruiting journalists to serve the agenda of a particular ideology. You know, in the Cold War, after the Cold War, as the CIA was being formed for the first time, Harry Truman was opposed to a civilian intelligence agency, but he got a lot of pressure from the people that were running intelligence under the OSS at the end of World War II, William Donovan and various people. But one of the prime movers was a guy named John McCloy. And John McCloy, when he died, was described by the New York Times as the chairman of the establishment. He was the governor for the occupation of Germany. And he had been, as a young lawyer, he started investigating espionage activities by the Germans in World War I and the demolition of a munitions dump in America in Black Tom Island. And his experience then in dealing and investigating this whole thing and seeking reparations for this clandestine activities that was done during World War I led him to a special interest in espionage and those sorts of things. And he was an advocate for the CIA doing clandestine activities, black bag jobs, et cetera, second story jobs. That informed a lot of it. Robert Story was the same way. And these fellows put together this network using individuals in banks, law firms, others that was there to encourage the ideology, the anti-communist post-war ideology and support the Cold War. So now we see the end of the Cold War and then the evolution into the War on Terror. And one of the people who was informing us more about the War on Terror was Lawrence Wright. And he was a participant in these programs that were developed at the end of of World War II, later on in the 60s and into our more current era. So my question to Lawrence Wright has been, and he's never answered any of these questions, but why he never mentioned Robert's story, why he never mentioned that background with his family, why he never acknowledged these things. They need to be acknowledged. We need to know about these things. We need not just Lawrence Wright, he's just an example. But how many journalists are affected have too cozy a relationship with ideological interests? I think that's a question worth exploring. Carl Bernstein wrote a very famous story in Rolling Stone in the late 1970s about Operation Mockingbird and how the CIA had infiltrated newspapers, and some 400 journalists he described as either being on the payroll or participating wittingly or unwittingly with the CIA. Well, there was a lot more to that story that Bernstein never touched back then, and that kind of question is still alive today. What influences are we seeing over the media that exists?
Scares the hell out of me sometimes, actually.
Right.
No, I think it's worth being scared about.
So, like I said at the beginning of the show, we are live on 28 or something platforms, but I had a question just come in that I kind of want to bring to you real quick here. It says, do you feel as if there has been a huge lack of editors in modern day journalism, or that the content quality that is looked for, has dropped?
Absolutely. As I said earlier, this institutional knowledge that comes from working newspaper desks and working out of newsrooms is lost to us. And so I saw over my career editors who came in who didn't have street experience. They didn't have experience of actually working beats. They didn't really have experience in developing sources, but they were in charge of putting things together. So I think we have seen a demise in all of that, and we're less skilled about it. And so that's a problem. That's something that we need to think about. We need good editors, just as we need good reporters. We need reporters who are aggressive and not afraid to go out on the street and look at things as they really are and come back and report vigorously and honestly and aggressively about it. But you also have to have good editors, because editors are helping to decide what stories are worth getting in front of the public and how soon and how thoroughly they should be written or investigated. And so that's a serious issue, I think. We've lost all of that network of those people with that kind of experience.
It seems to me that, in today's world, editors are not necessarily as interested in the context of the story, but whether or not the story will sell the papers.
That's always existed, Jeff. I
so
think
it boils right back down to money.
Well, it does boil down to money, and I've said in other conversations about this that the business model that newspapers use, the advertising model, that's the most dramatic thing that happened to them with the internet. Was the internet took a lot of that away, so they no longer have the revenue. Newspapers used to make 14, 15, 16% profit. And part of the reason they made such great profits is because they didn't pay guys like me hardly anything. But, the journalists did it for the love of it as much as they did it for the money. So, but they've lost that tremendous revenue stream. So they don't have the resources that they once had. We need to find another way to build a business model so that we can have reporting that's vigorous and supported. It has to be either nonprofit or it has to be based on something else. There are some programs going on out there, usually with journalism schools, I think, in which foundations are supplying some money and encouraging academians to, in addition to teaching, to try to do some journalism and publish. But you got to find a platform to publish these things on. The newspapers, one of the things I find fascinating about the old days was that when I would cover a story on a murder, say, or something like that, and if it was high profile enough, that story would be picked up by United Press International or Associated Press, and I would get a check about 3 weeks later for $3. You could buy a 6-pack of beer back then for $3, you know. So it was always great to get that little check. But what that did was that story went out to newspapers all over the country. That little story, and editors, wire editors, sitting around in their desk looking for something to fill a 3-inch hole might pick up that story and plug it in, and you've got a fabric of news being reported across the country. Now you only get the big stories. You only get the national interest. You don't get much of that local reporting being shared throughout the country. So we lose that sense of community. And you don't get the small stories being reported in local communities anymore that really sewed communities together. So I think we miss a lot when this journalism is not functioning well, and it's not.
Okay. And I find there's a lot of contradiction out there between reporters these days too. You know, this one says this one says this. It's like, you know what? Skip the bullshit. I just want the fucking truth, people. That's all I want.
Well, how about some just good, straightforward reporting? Because it seems like our news people are all commentators, and they've all got an opinion. You know, right. I got an invitation on an email a few days ago asking me if I would go take people to the polls for the election. You know, me and 10,000 other people around here got those messages. And I sent him back a note, and I said, look, I'm a journalist, and I don't engage in partisan politics. And back in the day, we didn't even vote in primaries. You didn't vote in a primary because there was a public record. If you were a journalist, you didn't want to be lined up with a political party. That impaired your sense of objectivity. You know, I want to be able to report on Democrats and Republicans and who's saying what evenly and fairly. And I think
that's not the case today.
That's not so much the case. Everybody's got an opinion. And once they render their opinion, I mean, there are a lot of people out there on MSNBC or even Fox News or CNN that I like to listen to. I like Richard Engel's reporting from war zones on, on MSNBC.
Yeah.
But everybody's got an opinion except for people like Richard Engel. They've got an opinion on what the news means, on how they feel about it. That's not appropriate for a journalist. That's something else.
No. They try and impress onto the public and their viewers how they feel and what they see, and how they react to it, that's controlling.
And they characterize that as the right way to think. Well, the CIA had an idea of what was the right way to think for Americans to think, and what was the right thing for us, for attitudes to be, and they worked at controlling those ideas by influencing journalists. You know, the publisher of this book wrote a foreword. His father was a CIA person, and he recounted a little story that his father told him about what they called sway pieces, and little things that help encourage people to believe one way or another. Well, sway pieces are not control, but they certainly are influence. Mm-hmm. And we see more sway pieces today, I think, than at any time previously. It's the reality.
It's absolutely true.
Yeah.
If you plant the seed, it will grow.
Yeah. And if you plant a seed of a false story and you keep repeating it over and over, pretty soon people begin to believe that there's a seed of truth in that story, where there may be no truth at all.
Right.
Isn't?
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay.
So what's the best advice you would give to an aspiring journalist today? Like somebody who's really trying to put his best foot forward and trying to, report just the truth.
Wear a helmet.
I love it.
Well, all of us could be journalists. It's the platform and the reach of our voice that is affected. But, I found that if you, even when I was reporting back in the day for a weekly newspaper, I could stir the hell out of everything with a well-reported story that other people weren't looking into. There's a lot to look into. I taught journalism at Indiana University part-time and at Metro State College in Denver part-time. And I saw some students who I would immediately have recommended for jobs because they didn't have any experience, but they weren't afraid to talk to people. And they weren't afraid to keep asking questions until they got an answer. And they understood how to go about, talking to a lot of different sources and getting a lot of different perspectives. The talent is out there to do good journalism. It's just the mechanism is not working. So I would encourage journalists to be brave about, reporting on their local community. I met a couple of reporters. I'm living on the West Coast now in Cannon Beach, Oregon. There's just small newspapers around here, little weeklies. And I've met a couple of the reporters here. They don't have a big audience, but they have the same kind of power that any journalist has ever had if they want to dig into stories that really mean something to people, dig into what their local government is doing, or deal with the local police. These days you go into the police department and you ask the public relations person to get you a copy of a report. Well, screw that. You take it, you go after it yourself. Go find the cop that was there at the scene. Go find the people that were there at the scene. Don't take handouts. Don't stand around and wait for press releases. That's the death of journalism. Get out and find out what's going on, and don't be afraid to hold your hand up and say, hey, that ain't right.
Okay. Now, do you think some journalists out there are maybe afraid of just being totally open and honest in fear of losing their job because they're not following the system?
That could well be. I've said this many times. Newsrooms in the old days were a lot like police departments in a certain way. You had the support from inside the newsroom. You were part of a group who had similar ideas about how things ought to be done. And the thin blue line in police protecting each other sort of existed in the newsroom as well. You had each other's back. If you were working on a story and another reporter heard you talking to people about that and knew a particular fact or a source or something, they came and shared it with you and helped you work on it. There was a really cooperative feeling, a group feeling of community within newsrooms, and I think that's what helps. That kind of thing helped encourage people to go out and take things head on, and then suffer the consequences, whatever they were, and often there were consequences. I remember doing a story on a police chief who had falsified some records to help encourage his promotion, and I found those records. I wound up hiding in a closet actually that night because I was in a merit commission, what they call the merit commission office, and a secretary was copying these reports for me secretly, and a cop came to the door and walked in, and I wound up hiding in the closet for about 20 minutes until he left. But the police chief pulled up behind me on the street and invited me into his squad car and gave me holy hell for a half an hour about why I had busted up his career and what I thought I was doing, and he thought I was a friend and all that. The reality was, and I told him, look, the facts are the facts, and you got to deal with it, and that's the way it is. That's what we need to know. More of that. We need more of that.
Right.
Yes.
Aggressive reporting.
I agree.
Yeah. My mind is just blown right now. So.
It's all right. So, yeah. Oh, wow. Okay.
We've got about 3 minutes.
I always like to ask these questions. Okay.
We're going to the weird ones.
Okay.
Yeah, we're gonna go to the weird questions.
Oh boy.
Right. I like
I got two. I'll do my standard too. What do you like in your pizza?
What do I like in my pizza? Black olives, anchovies, mushrooms, extra cheese.
Okay. All right. And the second question is, are you a dog guy or a cat guy?
I'm a dog guy. I raised Labradors for service dogs for a good number of years. I've had a lot of dogs. Al Capone was the best dog I ever had. He was, so yeah, I'm definitely a dog guy. I love dogs.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I learn a lot about people, believe it or not, just with those two questions and how they answer.
Well, that's exactly right. And, often when I start an interview in which people are going to talk about really serious stuff, I ask them stuff exactly like that. So you got a dog?
I mean, I'm a dog and cat guy, but I did learn one thing. I'll never go off a pizza with you.
Was it the mushrooms that killed it?
Yeah.
It's quite the combination there, I have to admit.
There's no accounting for taste. There's just no accounting for taste.
Who's going to play you in the movie?
In the documentary?
No, in the movie about your life when it comes out in 10, 15 years. Well,
I think probably
journalist Dan Luzadder.
De Niro will be dead by then, I'm sure. But I don't know. It would be a tough guy. My kids don't believe I'm a tough guy. I was a baseball player and all that stuff. They don't hear all the good stories.
Right.
But yeah, I'd have to have a tough guy. I get to play myself in the documentary, though. So.
There you go. Nobody can play you like you.
I don't think so. Or would want to.
True.
Well, I see either John Goodman or Mel Gibson.
Mel Gibson, yeah. Mel Gibson might be pretty good.
Yeah. Mel would be a good one.
I think Denzel Washington would be even better.
Who?
Denzel Washington.
Denzel Washington.
We can make that work.
Yeah, I think we could.
That's how
that
you
would be
said
hilarious.
It first. I was like, what?
Wow.
I will say I've had a lot of great experiences in journalism. I've met wonderful people, and many of them were journalists. But I always enjoyed the camaraderie and also the irreverence, and that's a quality in journalists that everybody ought to have, a good sense of irreverence.
Right.
What's the one? What's the word? I just lost the word. Interview that you want to get done that you've never been able to achieve?
That's a tough one. Well, if we don't exclude people that are already passed, I guess
you can take anybody.
Yeah, pick anybody. I think I would pick Lee Harvey Oswald.
Interesting.
Yeah. He comes up in my book, The Manchurian Journalist, because of a story Lawrence Wright told about Jack Ruby, a story that wasn't accurate. But
imagine the hidden truths you could find out from that.
Yeah.
Right.
Wouldn't it be interesting to know all the details of where Ruby was, or where Oswald was, and what he was doing at particular times? But,
wow. Yeah. Seance time.
Oh, jeez. You know who Dan actually would get along great with in talking would be John Barber, the gentleman that did all the JFK assassination documentaries that we interviewed. So, because he actually had sources, as you say, that actually had the actual tapes.
Really?
And things. Yes. This gentleman was deported 5 times by the government.
Yeah,
because he kept pushing.
Send me his email address.
Oh yeah, you'd love to talk with him.
Actually, believe it or not, Harlan connected me with John.
Really?
Yeah. So I'll send Harlan a message and tell him that Dan's interested in talking to John Barber.
There you go. Harlan would find him. Yeah.
Oh, he still has his info, I'm sure.
I'm sure he does.
So
nice.
But we are just a little over time, which is fine by us, but we don't want to keep you too long. Any last questions from the peanut gallery?
Oh no, I asked my two.
I gotta know, what is the hobby outside of journalism? What do you do? Are you a Lego builder?
Gosh, I've never had a hobby. Journalism was my hobby, and writing. I guess is my hobby. My sister's a poet, writing's always been important to us. It's a little ironic that I wound up in this position because I've told this story before. When I was a sophomore in English, I was flunking. Sophomore in high school, I was flunking my English class. I didn't know anything about grammar. I couldn't tell you what a verb or a noun was, anything else. And so my mother sent me to a tutor at the local college, an English teacher of all things. And after 3 weeks, she just threw up her hands and said, "You're too thick-headed. You'll never learn any of this stuff. You take a notebook home and you just write something. I don't care what it is. I'll show you how to fake it." And so I went home. I took the notebook. I wrote some stuff. I brought it back to her. She sat and she read it, and she started to cry. And she said, "Don't ever let anybody try to teach you grammar again. You just write. Just write." And I followed that, all my life. I make a lot of mistakes on commas and things like that, but you won't read the same kind of stuff.
Well, you get an editor for.
Yeah, that's what you hired. Right. Yeah, they could have done a better job on the Manchurian journalist. We had a few commas out of place.
Oh.
Yeah, my editor is sitting right there, right next to me. So I do a lot of the writing for our novels and things, and I send it to him, and it's just one long fucking sentence, all capitals.
Yeah,
it's a lot of fun. I'd rather put on spandex and go ride a bicycle.
Hey, as long as you're not a pole vaulter.
Yeah, not me. I do ride bicycles, but still at my advanced age.
So one thing that our normal producer, when he's here, likes to ask is, what's one thing that Dan geeks out about? And what I mean by that is, like, we've had a guest on that geeks out over the history of sunken ships. So what is one thing that people don't know about Dan that he really geeks out about? Like that
you into Marvel movies? Do you play with Barbie?
No.
Other than bringing the truth.
No. But I do. I mean, I do love detective stories, and as I say in the book, all my heroes were detectives. I love Sherlock Holmes all the way down, and James Lee Burke's characters, Dave Robichaux and his novels. Those are the people that get my admiration. I love a good detective. And my father was the person that actually was the first detective I ever ran into. He wasn't a detective. He was the Texaco man and then an insurance salesman. But I stayed home from school one day when I was in 6th grade, and he said, "You stay in bed if you're going to stay home from school." I said, "Okay, I will." So he left, and he came back an hour later. He walked into the bedroom. He said, "Get your clothes on and get your ass to school." I said, "Oh, I'm sick." He said, "No, you got out of bed and you were watching TV." I said, "Well, how do you know that?" He said, "The TV's hot." That was my first exposure to good detective work.
And later on in life, it was, "I know you went out because the engine's still warm."
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent. So, I mean, great stories, great show. Folks, check the show notes up above or down below. Make sure you pick up a copy of both books. Both books that we've mentioned, and they're both right there.
Maturing Journalists and Street Talk.
Well, thank you. You beat me to it. They're right behind them.
I see them.
That's right.
They've been behind them the whole time.
Yeah, that's a trick I'm learning from watching people on TV.
Right.
It works.
It
works.
Yeah.
It's that subliminal plant the seed.
There you go. Yeah.
So when you're not doing these fun interviews, where do you like interacting with your fans? Social media.
I told somebody asked me that I didn't have any social media, and so I did go and do an Instagram account, and I just did a website that's all fresh and new. But
nice.
But you can find it out there.
It's probably in the show notes, folks. I'm just gonna say. Jar Jar.
Up above or down below?
Yeah.
Hey, you can catch me every Tuesday on Splash Pages, every Wednesday on Still Token. Always find me either on Facebook or YouTube at both of those places. Let's see. And that's about it. Going to Terrificon.
Is that it? You good?
That's it.
Okay.
That's it. I'm good.
When's Terrificon? Next weekend?
I don't know.
Yeah, the weekend after this one.
Oh, okay. All right, cool. Yeah, as far as us, just go to stilltoken.com or Token with the Dead on Facebook. Every link will be there. All our previous shows will be there. You can find a lot of our shows now also on Red Coral Universe, which is a streaming platform available on all your smart TVs. If I don't think they're very fucking smart myself, but
oh, dude, they're smart because when you say something into your smart TV, it comes up on your phone 10 minutes later. Like, how do you know I was looking at that? What is going on?
Yeah, you just Google something and then it shows up on Facebook.
Yeah, your entire news feed.
Right. I don't trust anything anymore. They're all listening.
Big brother.
They're all listening. So go to stilltoking.com and you'll find out everything, and then you can stop fucking listening. I'm done.
You sure?
Yes.
Rant over?
Yes. Rant over.
So want to thank Dan for coming out and sharing these amazing stories, talking about his 2 new books, the 3rd potential book next year, his documentary film that he's working on that I'm super psyched to see. Hopefully he gets it done before, my eyes go completely.
We hope.
Yeah, like Jeff said, check us out on stilltoking.com. You can find out everything about the novel, the comic books, the TV series, the upcoming animation, where we're going to be on tour, which I don't even know where we are next.
We are in
Pittsburgh.
Yeah, Steel City Cannabis Convention.
Steel City Cannabis Convention and Mega Reptile Show.
Yes,
Nice.
in Monroeville, just outside of Pittsburgh.
Right. So I think we'll be down there in September. With that, to all our veterans and first responders, we want to thank you for doing what you do so people like us can come up here and do what we do. Stay safe. We'll see you next week. Dan, if you don't mind, just hang tight till the show closes, please.
I will.
We're out of here.
Peace.
Maybe. Let me find the button. There it is.